Thank you so much, and welcome to the 5th webinar in the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, or NILOA series, in talking about assessment and what we're hearing and learning in the field, and trying to be responsive and help people think about different ways to move forward. So there is no requirement for you to have been a part of any of the other webinars. If this is your first webinar, welcome. Say hi in the chat. For those that came on when we were having our conversation, we were sharing some secret hidden skill set that we have that no one knows about. So if you want to use that as a way to introduce yourself in the chat, this is a great opportune moment to share what it is. We're still looking for a drummer and a bagpipe player. But today I am joined by Brad and Joe. There's their pictures, but they're also there in the screen so you can see them. And what we're talking about today is evidence-based storytelling. And so the way that this is going to go for our time together today is I'm going to give a short sort of recap. I'll play the Cliff Notes version of our prior 4 webinars about why we've done things in the way that we have and where we want to go in this conversation and why we're talking about evidence-based storytelling. I'll then introduce evidence-based storytelling and some related tools that we have on it. You guys also get to be the first to know today, at the end of this webinar, we are releasing a communication toolkit targeted to help messaging around assessment. So you will get that when you get the email of the slides. So slides will be shared, you'll get the toolkit. This is being recorded. We'll have it posted on the website so that you can watch it later. We do have a Twitter hashtag we're using to keep talking, which is the NILOA webinar. And if you aren't familiar, we do have an ongoing Google Doc of resources related to all things assessment and teaching and remote instruction shifting and that kind of thing. But very excited to have Joe join us, who's going to talk about his perspective as an assessment person, thinking about messaging on assessment at this time, and then share how he's thinking about evidence-based storytelling with an example from National University. And then Brad will come in after Joe, and he's going to talk about, in his role as a professor of communication and department chair, he's going to share an example of evidence-based storytelling around Communication 101 from Saint Xavier University, as well as a few tips as a comm guy on how to, what do's and don'ts in crisis management communications. So give some pointers there as we're thinking it up. And of course, we'll open it up for discussion at the end and ask questions and get in the chat and talk with each other and learn and all that beautiful thing. So that's our plan today, and I'll go ahead and kick it off. So just for a brief recap on our first webinar we had was just a community check-in on some basic things. It was, please, to Deborah's point, this is not a test of online education. We did a quick pivot to remote instruction, and this is not about thinking about best practices of learning online. It's about learning during a global pandemic crisis. That's a different kind of thing. Compassion, not compliance, should drive our decisions at this point in time. We need to make decisions sometimes before guidance follows, and guidance should be following what decisions we make for our students based on what they need. So we need to listen to students and be flexible, but please don't over-survey them. Partner with your student affairs to survey. Give them a phone call or something, but be mindful about too much. And on the assessment side of things from that first one is, please don't require a higher level of proof in an online environment than you would in a face-to-face class. And so as you start to think about future planning in online in upcoming terms, something to have in mind. Our next community check-in conversations, we're going, hey, maybe we should rethink, and that starts from a place of negativity on our student perceptions and creating policy. So we really don't want to be going, all our students are going to be cheaters. How do we stop that? And instead think about how are we enabling learning as we move into these different spaces. There's also a lot of conversations on modifying end of course faculty evaluations and how does that look as a planning tool for the future, and what do we do with reports? Assessment's going on, we're doing that all the time in our courses, but do we take the reports? Is that a lower priority? Do we push the time back, and what does that look like? So all of those are on recorded webinars that you can take a look at from the website. We then moved into a conversation about assignment design. So it was basically, we have questions about how do we revise our assignments in this situation? What do we do? And we turned around a revised 2-pager on thinking about how to do assignment conversations in our current environment with modified questions for online and student situations that are going on in relation to coronavirus and COVID-19. So thinking about how do we modify this to really get the learning and the things that we want. The next one we talked about planning. So thinking about how do we use our curriculum maps to think about planning into the future and the fall and the learning that can happen in there. We turned around from that one, a little 2-pager on thinking about program planning in relation to that. So we've been trying to, as we have a conversation, turn it around with a tool that you can take and use something with. So how do we modify our assignments? How do we think about planning? This week, we're talking about how do we talk about all the stuff that we did and how do we tell our stories in meaningful ways? And then we have one left next week where we will go into transparency and have conversations on that space. So that gets you caught up. You are now all informed, and that's wonderful. But what is evidence-based storytelling? What exactly are we talking about today? So evidence-based storytelling actually comes from work that we did at NILOA with a collection of case studies at institutions that were using assessment evidence across the entire institution. We're really using it to get into improvement conversations and what was going on with that. And when we went and talked to those institutions about what was unfolding, what we found that was going on was this concept that we refer to as evidence-based storytelling. So we really define that as evidence of student learning that's used in support of claims or arguments. 2 caveats on that first part. Evidence is very broad. This can mean a lot of different things. It can be qualitative, it can be quantitative. And the point about the in support of claims or arguments is that people were really using this not just to say, here's a list of what I did, but to make a case, really make an argument for something, and thinking about those models, about how we were improving or we were being accountable as institutions through stories that they were telling that were to persuade a specific audience. Couple of caveats on there. This was really great because it wasn't, here's a data story. This was, here are the people behind our data, and here's how these things fit together. So it's not one at the expense of another. It's an infusion of those two. And really thinking about who is the audience to which we're communicating our stories was something that in a lot of our prior assessment conversations, we write reports to write reports, or there's an external them that we were writing to, and really thinking about what piece do we want to target in on was something that we were seeing on these campuses. So we started getting into this conversation space of, well, this is a really interesting concept. How can we think about this more broadly in relation to assessment and this work? And one of the first questions that we got is, why stories? You could do a lot of different ways of thinking about it. Why do we have our focus in here on storytelling? And part of that is very intentional in terms of stories help us see things that we otherwise wouldn't be able to see. They uncover truths in a different way. They help us go exploring in our assumptions that we have about ourselves and our roles, and they provide a mechanism by which we can reflect on our practices and our teaching. So stories actually, they engage different things even in your brain, and so it's a different way of connecting and communicating with people. So storytelling and stories really seem to be that connective tissue that made sense in this space. You can also think about this if you're a higher ed person. Burton Clark talks about organizational sagas, very similar kind of connection point. Happy to talk about that if anybody wants to nerd out. Lee Schulman also has a piece on thinking about you have to have a narrative to give an account. Accountants, even as it's about it's not just the numbers. To really provide an account means you have to tell of the narrative in these spaces. And so it's really thinking about, we've been pretty decent in some areas, but we haven't been really effective in telling our stories in meaningful ways. When we get into our conversations now and sort of where we are as we think about our work, we really have some stories that we need to be prepared to tell about the decisions that we've made at this time and why we've made these decisions, what the impact is of those decisions, and how does this relate to students and learning. That's the kind of documentation that we need to be thinking about in that space, is what do we want to say? What stories do we need to be able to tell? Another thing to think about in this space too is we have stories of loss to tell. This was not the semester that anyone expected. And having space to talk about that and tell that story. Some might be a story of tragedy. We need space to share and tell. And it's a way in a time of physical distance that we can feel proximity in a different way and reconnect in the community that we are within our institutions and our programs in higher ed. So also providing a space to share our own stories of our experience in this time can be very important. And last, really just that larger idea of how do we want to talk about what we did during this time? We're going to have reports, we'll have review, we have accreditation visits. What are the stories that our students will tell of this experience? And how are we thinking about and preparing to engage in that space? So stories can be very important for a wide variety of reasons, but I think increasingly useful to how we think about what documentation and reporting means now, but also how we help as a community move through this space. So if you want to get into it, we did create a evidence-based storytelling toolkit that we went around and we took a model and we tried it at all these different institutions to basically say, can you peer review each other's stories and give people feedback on the narrative? All the materials related to that you can find on our website, along with examples and resources. So definitely take a look at that. And then if you're also interested in something that has a narrative focus to it, the Excellence in Assessment designation, one of the reasons that that was created with our partners was to really help push on that narrative piece if we need to explain why we do the things that we do for the students that we have and thinking that through. So those are some tools and examples that you can pull from. In the evidence-based storytelling toolkit, what you'll find is help thinking through how to story development, some tips for report writers. We did a lot of document analysis, and there are some things that we consistently saw across that we wanted to turn into useful information. And then if you want to engage in some kind of feedback or peer review process or have somebody take a look and give you targeted feedback on a report, we do have handouts, feedback sheets, and that kind of information in there. So it gives you some, you can do it on your own, or you have the materials to work with other people as you think through. There are different areas in the toolkit. I'm not going to go into each of them because Brad in his example will actually walk you through in a lot. So he's got it covered in his slides. If you have questions about it, I'm very happy to talk. The two that I will point out that we consistently see as being very important is audience. Who are your audiences? What are you trying to do with this stuff? And data visualizations. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you stick it in there, okay? So thinking through, does it help the narrative? Is it adding in? We've seen some reports that are just like, look at the cool things that I can create in Power BI, which is neat, and you can share that with your friends, but might not be audience connected. Now, I have one last thing, and since Joe, if you are not familiar with Joe and his presentation style, he is a GIF master. They have a badge for that. He would have them all and have turned it into a GIF. So this is my transition GIF of being excited. We are releasing at the end of our webinar today, I'll be sending out to all of you our communication toolkit that we've put around the questions people have had about messaging. And there's various activities in there, some to really help us get down what are our value statements. There's some templates for how do we develop communication plans and questions to help guide your thinking about communication in that space. So I'm very excited to have that come out and before everyone else. So good job being on the webinar. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Joe.
Thanks, Natasha. In asked to present here, my name is Joe Levy. Hi, everyone. My day job is being the Executive Director of Assessment and Accreditation at National Louis University, based in Chicago, Illinois. And when Natasha reached out to talk about evidence-based storytelling, I said, oh, that's perfect, because that's actually been a big, sharing around assessment results and reporting has been a big focus for us this year, where we've been, trying to think about what all do we share, who are we sharing with, and why are we sharing. But before we get into that, I think it's important for us to talk about what's going on right now and some real-time messaging about the environment we're in. So first, for faculty and staff, I think it's very important that we recognize people are doing their best, and that we truly care about the learning experience of our students. That never changes. That has been a steady heartbeat to the work that we do, and we need to remember that. So in light of that, it's also important that we, because we care and we know that we're trying to do all that we can and be effective in what we're doing, we should be doing assessment work, right? I mean, the core of assessment work is articulating our expectations, putting interventions in place that we hope learning will occur, and then measuring it to see if we're being effective and how students are learning. So now more than ever, we need to be, just as we're putting things in place and hoping that the interventions and adjustments we're making are effective, assessment can help answer that. Now, that being said, before anyone gets up in arms, what I want to be clear is that I'm not saying that assessment is doing exactly what you had planned. Natasha, if you want to go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So yeah, I'm not saying that you have to stick to what your assessment plan was at the beginning of the year. I'm also not saying, similar to Natasha's, the first point in the first webinar, what we're doing right now is not necessarily to be benchmarked with previous data and to be hailed as, our best work here. But that in doing this, it's okay to be simple and straightforward in your approach, to back off, to adjust your assignments, and truly just engage with students to see what they're learning and how their experience is going. So I think then, in light of all of that, right? So if assessment's important, and we're not saying you have to stick to what you're doing, you may have some questions. That's where the assessment people can come into play, right? Let us help you. We are here. It is our job to help you succeed, because if you're not successful in assessment, it reflects poorly on us, because we'll be asked, well, why isn't this happening? And so let us help you. Don't hesitate to ask questions, send a meeting request, or otherwise reach out, because we're here to help. So I'll now pivot from talking to faculty and staff that are doing academic and student affairs assessment and talk to my assessment folks. And in this current time, know that your role may be different. And so first of all, like the image here is, don't feel like assessment is, this thing that people are damning and that, we shouldn't be asking people to do. But in our roles, as Natasha alluded earlier, we need to be supportive, we need to be flexible, and the support that we're providing may be different than what we've been doing, right? If you're at an institution where assessment operates pretty well and you have your assessment champions who are able to handle their usual responsibilities and do their reports without much help, that may not be the way things look right now, just given everything going on. So you may have to be a little more hands-on. You may have to be, encouraging people, walking people through support. You may be having to do a little more hand-holding or data analysis or support than you usually offer. So realize that and be there. Be there to support the faculty and staff. And going to the next slide, in light of that, in trying to be helpful, truly be helpful. So give grace, be flexible, consider, think ahead about your plans, your reports, your templates. Think about where there can be give and what flexibility you can offer, so that as you're engaging people and you maybe see like the stress in their face or the fear. And I think where a lot of angst comes is with assessment as this process, and people realizing, I don't think I can maintain that process as it was in the current environment. So let them know that's okay, and let them know that things can be different. And again, just remind them of the underlying purpose and relevance of assessment right now. And going back to Natasha's point, I mean, right now, keep telling stories. Now more than ever is the time to talk about the great work we're doing, the adjustments we're making, that we are listening to students, and that we're doing all we can, because those are great stories to tell. So I did want to go through some high-level considerations around evidence-based storytelling. The first is, when you're putting a story together with your assessment data, make sure you know what your purpose is. So are you trying to put something out there as an FYI? Are you trying to engage an audience in a way that, this is further information? Are you trying to raise a question with other decision makers? Are you trying to foster interest, spur action? Know what your purpose is to help hone your message. With that, once you have your sort of message picked, make sure you're using language that your audience understands. It's very easy to get lost in acronym soup, as well as if you're talking to folks who aren't in the day-to-day with a given program or with learning outcomes or your interventions, you need to speak to them in ways that they understand, as well as in ways that connect, in using the language that connects to their priorities and their interests, so that you're bringing them into the conversation. You also need to think about length. So think about the audience you're working with and know whether it's appropriate to give them, a 10-page report, or to give them just the highlights, like a one slide piece in a PowerPoint. And think to what you're comfortable speaking to, as well as what's reflective of being important in your area, and what you're trying to convey here. If it's just an FYI piece, yeah, this shouldn't be a 20-minute presentation. But if you're trying to garner their interest, trying to get their buy-in, you might have to ramp up and lead into that. So be aware of that. I think it's important to leverage existing mechanisms as you're thinking about sharing. Realize you're not always starting from scratch. When you think about sharing information for a campaign. All right, Natasha, if you go past the GIF is great, but I have some language, but some examples. But first is syllabi and course maps and curriculum maps. Know that you can contextualize and explain those. Those already exist, and they tell a story if you look to the story beyond just the information on the course or the articulation. I mean, this is great information for other faculty to bring on an adjunct who's maybe just teaching one course, let them know how it's situated in the program, the connections it has, beyond the course itself. It's also great to explain to students in helping them see what they've learned so far and how this course is adding to their learning, introducing new concepts, and relating to their path ahead. Another example are websites, flyers, newsletters. Things that you already have in place, you can use to highlight and communicate and push out assessment stories that you have. And last but not least, use the meetings that you have. When you have your captive audience, use it to talk about assessment. Use it to celebrate the great work that you've done. Use it to contextualize and reinforce your direction forward, changes you need to make, actions you need to take with the data that you have. Likewise, especially from an advisor perspective, when students are sort of moving from one season to another, or one part of the program to another, reminding them of the learning that's happened, what's coming up ahead. If there's a particularly difficult part in the program or course, encourage them, let them know, like, hey, we've been getting great feedback from previous students and making all these changes. We're really excited for you to dive in here next term. So you can push those seasonal talking points and keep this information relevant throughout the year. So then for us, one of the things that, to put myself in the hot seat, my area, assessment and accreditation, our goal this year has been trying to position ourselves as, and make sure everyone looks at us as approachable, engaging, helpful, and resourceful. Which is easy for us to say. I mean, I always like to say, oh, I'm totally approachable. But I know that for faculty and staff, assessment can be intimidating. It can be a bad word. It can dredge up bad feelings. But again, if you genuinely understand that I am here to help in any way that I can, hopefully that would help. And so one of the things that we've been doing for that is creating a bunch of resources, updating reports with more color and varying formats, and trying to do exactly what I've been doing in this presentation of having a little more engagement with GIFs and images. And so first I'll show just, this is an example of our University Learning Outcome Assessment Report. Notice lots of color, lots of bold elements. The external version we have is not sortable, but the internal version we have is actually a dashboard in Power BI that faculty and staff can filter down and look for their individual programs, and the data will be dynamic and reflect them. This other example is from our MBA program. And so the ULO report examples, we're putting a full report out there. And then this is an example of, this is what's being shared. This one program is really proud of their results with this CompXM report, or CompXM external instrument. But then they still have an action plan of further supporting the students where maybe they weren't meeting their target, or that they want to do better. And so this is an example that we're going to share and show that, look, sharing and telling your story doesn't have to be a novel, right? It can be very short, simple, to the point. The next example is one where This is a college thematic summary for the annual programs for the academic programs within one of the colleges. They just looked across and saw what themes were, and they wanted to share, even though faculty are very concerned about their program, letting them know, hey, look, these are the common goals across all of our programs. And so realize when you're thinking about DEI, diversity, equity, and gosh, I'm blanking on the I. Inclusion.
I got you.
When you're thinking about those efforts, know that you're not alone, right? And so if you know that that is a goal of yours and you're just not sure where to start, there's 11 other programs that are in that same boat and that you can reach out to them. But this is just a great snapshot to not only show what's happening in that college, but also communicate externally of a focus around this information. And then the last one is we had our career service office. They took their assessment results and actually made an infographic, which, as you can see, is lots of information crammed there, very engaging, lots of things to pay attention to. And so our idea this year is that we're putting all this information on our website. We've been collecting the examples so that we don't just have an empty website, and we're going to launch it hopefully in May. And once we have it up there, create some healthy competition and desire for people, oh, well, I want my program featured, or I want to share one of these things. And so we're just going to keep adding to that. And then my hope too is that the programs will then take my advice earlier in the slides and not just rely on this all being posted on the assessment website, because I am humbled enough to know that our website is not maybe the most trafficked website by faculty and staff. And so the hope too is that they start looking to share this information on their websites and through other channels of their own. And so the last two pieces I have is just one, the thing that my office tries to do around the storytelling element is we look for patterns. And so as we're pulling out these stories and within each individual area, we try to see what is emerging across the institution and use that both to encourage other people as well as identify potential strategies and areas to focus or expand or grow. And we also use it as a way to promote to other people of, hey, you could be sharing just like this. And then, my call out to you all to think about is, with respect to evidence-based storytelling, think about what stories you're telling versus not, who's included in those stories versus not, and who you're engaging versus not. And then for all of those nots, to try and minimize that. And so there's just one more animation there. Because we can prioritize to make change. And I think the more we focus on the story, the characters that are being included, the characters that are missing, the more we can do here. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Well done. And Brad, I wanted to bring you a cup of tea. I'm watching, I was like, no, the cough is real. But we will have time at the end if you have questions for Brad and Joe. Once we're done, we're going to open it up. You can unmute yourself and engage. But for right now, I'm going to pass this over to Brad and let him tell you about Saint Xavier University.
Mute. I need to unmute. Sorry, I got myself muted. Anyway, my cough is allergies. My temperature has stayed 97.5. No symptom, which is a good thing. In any case, I don't have those really cool Julie Time Life operator headphones and things like that. So I feel like I'm kind of the uncool kid on the block here. So anyway, my name is Brad Mello. I'm the chair of the Department of Communication at Saint Xavier University. In a previous life, I worked at the National Communication Association, where I worked on a learning outcomes project for communication. And that's sort of how I found myself in working in this kinds of information. But also, I do this now regularly as part of my job, the importance of assessing both our Communication 101, which is a course that everybody at the university has to take, as well as assessing the Department of Communication. But I'm going to focus on talking about the Com 101 and the story that we are trying to tell with our assessment process. Can we go to the next slide? So obviously, we started this project a little bit before the NILOA assessment kit came out, our evidence-based toolkit came out. But we've used this ever since to help frame the arguments that we're trying to make and think about how we do our assessment. So as the toolkit says, you need to think about both your primary audience. Who are you trying to target? Is it the administration? Is it policymakers? Is it students? Internal, external? Who is your audience? And then also perhaps think about, are there any secondary audiences that you might want to target? And hopefully your audience will not look like the audience on the right there. Although I don't know, that could be kind of fun to have a Rocky Horror Picture Show audience. So anyway, next slide. So when we sat down to think about who our audiences were for our assessment of COM 101 and what we were really hoping to do with this, and this is, I think, very different than how we used to think about it, where we just slap up some assessment and move forward. We really thought about, all right, why are we doing this, and who are we creating this for? Why are we trying to do this rather than just do it because we're supposed to do it? So we identified 4 particular audiences that were important in this process for our COM 101 course and our assessment processes. First of all, it was the General Education Committee, because the General Education Committee makes the decision about whether the course stays in the curriculum or not. And, you know, of course, we want the course to stay in the curriculum or not. So we knew that they were one of our audiences. The second audience was the faculty teaching the course. If you see on the right, that's the 4 full-time faculty, my colleagues that I get to work with, who I adore and miss terribly at the moment. But we do Zoom happy hours every other week, so that's kind of fun. But the faculty teaching the course are very important, because in addition to the full-time faculty, we have a significant number of adjuncts, and we need them all together, and we need to be able to tell our story to them so they can help us in our assessment process. And then that third audience there is the students. And we didn't at first think about assessment as something for students, because, you know, the assessment usually is for external audiences, administrators and whatnot. But we thought, if we're going to do this, we also want to find something in here that can help us speak with our students, and in particular to justify the course to them. And then, of course, the dean of the college, because quite frankly, that's a compliance issue. And my dean, I think she's on the call, so I'll suck up for a second. My dean's wonderful. But she does want to make sure we do our assessment processes well. And then finally, a secondary audience is that whatever we put out, we wanted it to be useful for accrediting bodies. We don't have to worry about that in our department. There are people above our pay grade that write the assurance arguments for HLC and such, but we wanted to make sure that whatever we produce would be something that would be useful for them in that process down the line. Yes, so after we thought about our audience, we thought we needed to think about what were our arguments going to be. And the toolkit talks about some things to think about. What's your argument that you make to your target audience? What's your goals? And what do you want the audience to take away from this story? That picture there below is the infamous Chicago double doink. And so we were very hopeful that we would not go into the double doink territory, our argument. So you can see on the right side of the slide there, the arguments that we tried. First of all, to the General Ed Committee, there's a typo in this, I apologize for that. Keep our course as a requirement. We meet the oral communication outcome, and we do it well. And then I'll load some evidence a little bit later that demonstrates that. To the faculty, we focused on getting them on board to teach the course as designed. Part of the story of this assessment process is I started at Saint Xavier in 2014 and inherited a course that was not standardized, which makes it difficult to assess. And so we were working with the faculty to try and get a course that's a little bit more standardized, since there's multiple sections teaching around 300, 350 students a semester. So we wanted the faculty to get on board with doing that. And then we focused on convincing students that this is a worthwhile course, that there's a reason for them to bother to take this course. And then, of course, finally, with the dean, straight up compliance, just we did it, check off the box, which was our argument, and that worked well. Next slide. Next step in the toolkit for evidence-based storytelling is, what is your evidence? And ask yourself those questions there. What evidence do you have to support your claims? Does this evidence, is it compelling to your primary audience? Do you actually have the evidence? And is the evidence that you think that they should be aware of? Is this what you really think that your audience needs to know? And so in some cases, we have come across answers where yes, we think we have the evidence that our audience needs to know. And in particular with our students, we think that we need to produce it. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So here's our evidence, and this goes back. We started this project in 2016, and we're still in the middle of it. This was the first phase where we collected a variety of speeches. So we collected from all our classes. So we had a little over 300 artifacts, and we took 10% of them, randomly took 10%, and we brought the entire department together. That picture of the 4 people you saw earlier, we all sat in a room together, and we normed using this rubric. We had to change it a little bit because the AAC&U rubric has levels, capstone, milestone, whatever, whereas at SXU we do exceeds, meets, minimally meets, or falls below. So we modified it just a little bit. And we use that rubric to evaluate. We started out with 39 speeches. We came into a little problem because 11 of them did not have sound for some reason, using the process that we used to record them in the classroom where the speeches were delivered. So anyway, but we did gather this data, and then if you go to the next slide, you can see my timer went away, and I want to make sure I stay on time. Okay, you can see the results of that from fall of 2016. So that's a little while ago. We have collected for fall of 19 because we're on a 3-year cycle, and so we will be having much shortly once we get through this semester via Zoom, doing this thing where we're all in a virtual room to look at all the speeches that we have collected and go through the same process. So we looked at this and we thought, well, what does this really mean though? What story does this evidence tell? And we told a story in our assessment report about this to the General Education Committee, that we're actually pretty good at getting our students to develop a central message and to find some supporting evidence to support that. But we were a little surprised that our delivery scores were low. So in the next iteration of this, yes, thank you, Natasha. We decided that we're going to focus on delivery because that delivery score is low, and that's something that we all hope somebody who goes through a public speaking class improves on the delivery. So, and then we thought about a variety of things there. First of all, we learned that we need to change our collection method because the recording system in the classroom wasn't working well. Also started with an assignment that was an assignment that was in the beginning of the semester, and we thought that it would probably be better to get a final assignment, as it says there, and that assignment was the same for everybody. So the original assignment was an informed speech, but it could be a variety of things. Whereas the final speech that we are now will be evaluating coming up, we've collected, we just have to do the actual evaluation of it, is a common assignment, a common persuasive speech assignment. And so if you go on to the next one. So we are now in a process of asking ourselves the next step in the toolkit, which is story and language. What's a story that we're telling? And so if you look at the list of things there, we are very specifically trying to tell a story of improvement and struggle. And then underlying that, compliance. We are required to do this, but we try not to put that up front. But you know, it's always nice to say, hey, we're doing what we're supposed to do, we're doing our job. But it's a improvement and struggle. So we struggled with our first round of doing this, and there were some issues, but we are looking towards improvement, and how are we going to do that? And our audience is very much interested in that story. And it's been helpful for us to think about and tell the story as a process of movement and struggle, because I mean, we're doing both, and that's very receptive to our particular audiences. In particular, adjunct faculty are very much involved in the idea of improvement, and they want to help with our program in terms of the Com 101 and making sure that course is as robust as it can be. Next. So who are the characters? This would be the next step in the toolkit. Sorry, I don't have GIFs. I'm going to have to take a lesson from Joe there about GIFs, but I do think this is a cool picture because I like Aquaman. What can I say? So who are the characters in your story? And the characters for us, and what we're very significantly focused on, are faculty and students. Those are the characters in our story. And how can faculty help students improve in their oral communication skills? And that's the only motivation that we focused on, that we want students to come out with the skills and abilities that will be helpful to them in a variety of different settings beyond the particular classroom. And so we've focused on, those are our two characters, the faculty that teach this class, and in particular the students. And not only are we meeting their needs, but are we helping them achieve the particular learning outcomes that we want them to achieve. We go to the next slide. Yeah. So this is the idea of the plot, and I didn't want to share with you our entire report, but it pretty much looks exactly like this: 5 sections: exposition, complication, climax, resolution. And we talked a little bit about our barriers. We didn't think about it in terms of conflict, but that's sort of the story that we told. And we're going to sort of get into the resolution up here in a second. So if we go to the next slide. You saw our one data visualization that we used, and this is very important to make sure that the data visualization that you use is easy to understand. So that graph that happened a couple slides back with the information of the scores on that particular speech was the only data visualization we used. We were very simplistic with it, and then we just told a narrative based on that data of information. We go to the next one. So, and finally, consider awareness and discoverability. I'm not sure this picture has anything to do with this slide, but Joe put a picture of Moira, my favorite character from Schitt's Creek. And I'm like, I have to have a Schitt's Creek picture in here somehow. Anyway, awareness and discoverability. Based on the story you crafted, what's the best medium through which to share it? And so we're required to do a written report. But what we've decided to start work on, because that written report, it speaks specifically to one audience, the faculty and, well, two audiences, the faculty and the dean. So we need to do that, but it doesn't speak to students. And no matter how we try and think about slicing it, it really doesn't speak to students all that well. So what we're doing is, and this is going to be a process because we have to get to use the student speeches. We're trying to get the best student speeches and edit it into an example of video of about 3 to 5 minutes showing, hey, you take one and here's the kinds of things that you'll be able to do when you leave that particular course. So we can go on to the next one. So I talked a little bit about this. Here are our story results. We did meet the needs of our various audiences, and that focusing on audience really helped us tell our assessment story. Our evidence led us to change assessment procedure a little bit. And we think of our story as an episodic one, much like a season of Schitt's Creek, which I cannot wait for the 6th season to drop. So we think of it as an episodic one. We've just told one episode, and we're about to work on the 2nd episode in this process, where we look at the data from 2019, and then where we'll move to help improve instruction. There on the right side, you see some of the things that we're already doing. We've created a common assignment. It's electronically. And then we created a instructional video to help students do electronically delivered presentations. That link there, we don't have time to click on it because that's about an 11-minute video. But one of the dudes that you saw further up in faculty is faculty, all of us, my colleague Blake is the star of this YouTube video that's an instructional video on how to deliver speeches in an electronic format. And so that's sort of our story and where we are. We think of it, as I said, as an episodic one. And then can we go to the last slide? Natasha also asked me to, as a comm guy, to talk about crisis communication a little bit, and thinking about it from telling the assessment story in current time. And I think a lot of this has been covered already. This is a sort of a modified version of one slide I use when I teach crisis communication in my public relations class. But some of the things I think are very important in the assessment is to communicate honestly with candor and openness. I've told my faculty that we're going to do this as best we can, but we have to do this. So that's candor and openness. We can't just not assess this year. We have to do this. Collaborating with credible experts in a crisis always works. And so we obviously collaborate with NILOA and AACU and use their resources to help us do our job better. Communicate with compassion, concern, and empathy. In particular with this class, our adjuncts are incredibly busy. Many of our adjuncts are teaching at 3 and 4 different places, and all of which have gone online in very different ways. And so we communicate with them in compassionate ways, and hopefully they can participate in the assessment. But if they can't, they can't. We as a full-time faculty members will take up the slack in that case, but we communicate with them compassionately as best as possible. This 4th one is to accept uncertainty and ambiguity. This I find very difficult for faculty because we tend to want things, what's my job? And so uncertainty, ambiguity, it's hard to accept at times, but I focus on that with the faculty that are involved with this assessment project. And then finally, send messages of self-efficacy, which is, hey, you can do this. You can do this assessment. It's not going to be more complicated or difficult because of the odd times that we find ourselves in, that we can do this, and that we'll be here to support. So that's my story.
Thank you, Brad. So, and just a reminder, you can keep the conversation going on Twitter, #NILOA webinar. All of our resources and things will be posted on the NILOA website, learningoutcomesassessment.org. But the remaining time is yours. So please feel free to unmute if you like and ask questions of Joe or Brad or myself. And I have not been in chat, but I'm going to get into chat. So if you asked a question earlier, you might want to re-enter it now because it'll pop up and I'll see it. So let me stop sharing so we can see each other and ask away.
Just to give Brad or Natasha a chance, 2 of the questions I responded to in the chat, one was how, this is all great information, but how do we best communicate and motivate this when faculty and staff are just worried about their jobs? And then the other question was, in light of everything shifting and everything going on right now, what themes of stories might we kind of push or tell, given what's going on? And just to recap what I had chatted, in case that's helpful or can give you all time to formulate some responses to those questions. I said for the first one about the job security piece, we absolutely need to be sensitive to that. I mean, just like we need to be sensitive to, people are dealing with, people are dying, right? And people are losing loved ones and they're under extreme stress, and we have to be sensitive to that. But on the same hand, we also have to recognize the people who still are fortunate and are employed to do work, because there's many people who aren't employed that would love that opportunity. And we, in our roles, we owe it to do our best for our students and to be doing the good work that we know we can do and that our institutions are trying to provide. And assessment helps evidence that and helps us know if we're succeeding and how well we're doing. And so that's how I would position it. But to a certain extent, and I use the analogy too of, it's like worrying about our safety. You can't just completely shut down and stop living your life for fear of contracting an illness, because even if you take all the precautions, there could still be a chance that some random thing happens that you get sick. And so, we still just have to do our job. And I know it's stressful. I have many family members of mine and, my wife and that are frontline health workers. And so, but, they're still doing their work, even though they might very well get sick, or that also, their hours might get cut and things might happen. So, we certainly need to be sensitive to it. And I think that's where the grace and flexibility element comes that we've been talking about. But, we also have to remind people that you are here to do a job, and you have to try your best to do it.
Yeah, I would add to what Joe's saying, and then Thomas, I see your hands raised. So when I'm done, go ahead and just, if you can unmute and ask a question, that would be fantastic. But I think part of the story that we tell at this time is this is not what anybody expected or wanted. Faculty didn't want to teach this semester in this way. They didn't want to have to shove what they've been doing into the environment they are. Students didn't want to have to do this. We all are in that this isn't what anyone anticipated or what anyone wanted, but we're trying. Some of us might be doing our best, and some of us are trying to do some other things, but we all have multiple complicated layers of that happening at the same time. So this is also a place to think about multiple narrators that tell multiple stories that are of the same thread and line. And so to Joy's point of like versus whose story is getting told and who's not, this is a great time to think about what are the student stories and what are those faculty stories, because even being heard is important. I think there's a lot of things that people feel are happening to them at this time, and feeling like they have an outlet to be heard where that is appreciated, understood, and elevated up is important for some of the just community feelings and mental stability that we all are striving for at this time. So thinking about this too as a way through is important. And I would add to that, we don't have examples of this because we're making the examples now in how we are responding. So the more that we can think about this not as, I need to see what other people are doing, but what's the story, like the chicken soup for the soul books or something that people had, like that was like a thing. I remember for all, like, what are the stories that we need to feed ourselves and our community at this time, and how do we want to handle that? You don't have to look for other people for that. You can look to yourself and your crew and what you need to engage with this, because there's not something that's a similar situation kind of a thing that we can point to think about this. So yes, but Thomas, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Yeah, and forgive me if I'm shifting gears at all. So I'm wondering, how would you compare the process or the methodology for storytelling to like case-based or case study type teaching?
Sure. I would say it's a way of presenting information and to think about it. And for us, it was important to signal to an assessment community. The language choices are very specific for an assessment community, I'll say that. So evidence, because a lot of times we live in quantitative, measurable, objective research places. So thinking about evidence and argumentation was something that was really important for the assessment community and getting into this storytelling space, which is maybe not always part of a case. Sometimes the case is just, here's the case. And what do we make of this? But really thinking, we have arguments that we're making supported by evidence. We're making claims about how we are improving, to Brad's point. We're making choices to improve, and we have reasons behind those choices. When prior, if you look at a lot of our reports and the way we talk about assessment, we tell you what we did. We give bullet lists of all the things that we did, hoping that one of those things meets someone's needs and is okay. And we don't really make the case about, this is why we're asking people to do this kind of learning, because it matters in this way. And we want to assess it like that because that makes sense for our department and who our students are. And we make these choices, and here's what came out of that. And that's why we're good stewards of educational resources, kind of thing. So that argumentation piece is slightly different, but I would say also there's similarities between, but the language we used around it was also to really help push assessment people to think about it differently. So we had others that raised their hands. Please. Thanks, Doss.
This is Joanne Beddinch from Oregon State. I really appreciate the really direct and detailed information. In our accreditation report, we did the usual answering of the standards with the data that we had collected. We also did, like many institutions do, and had spotlights that were stories to support the standard. And interestingly, a recent graduate, I'll call her a student, wrote the majority of those pieces. And so it was very interesting to look at what was potentially written about these examples in other pieces versus how she framed it. And she did an outstanding job, and we continue to say, make sure this goes into your resume and into your portfolio, because it was so powerful and brought such depth, I believe, to an otherwise pretty dry report, albeit a very long report. So the piece that I believe, Joe, you talked about length, is something to keep in mind. But thank you for this. And I've been offline with my staff members during this session, and we're certainly going to start incorporating some of this into our annual reports.
Awesome. Well, I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and we are at time. So I'm going to say huge thank you to Joe and Brad for being a part of this, and also coming in. I have a tendency in these, because we're trying to be responsive to field, so like right before we do it, be like, hey, what are you doing? You want to do a webinar? So I have to say huge thank you to everyone that's been a part of these so far, for stepping up and sharing as we try to pivot. If there's more resources you want, take a look at the learning improvement community as well. CBAN has a storytelling bank. There's a lot of interesting things out there that are referenced as resources in the toolkit. So yeah, enjoy your journey. Thank you for your time. Thank you to our co-presenters, and wash your hands. Take care, everybody.